we in the Western world, not just in the United Kingdom, not just in England, are getting closer to a political explosion, a massive backlash against over 50 years of policies, especially immigration policies, that have been directly existentially threatening to the population. The same kind of reactionary policies, the virtue signaling, the censorship, the strident condemnation of racism and nationalism, that's not going to work anymore. It's only going to provoke an asymmetrical response, which is going to bring them down. Welcome back to Men and the City. Hope you're doing well wherever you are. It's a bit of a foggy and cloudy day with a sprinkling of rain, so somewhat fitting for the rather murky waters that we're wading through, certainly over the last week. So for those of you that are paying attention, you know we've had trouble in financial markets. We've had the opening salvos of what I think is going to be a war between Iran and Israel that will likely metastasize into a regional war. That's something we talked about earlier this year. And we've got some serious economic trouble. So the world is very definitely in the throes of tremendous instability. But today's video, I want to talk about England. So today's video is going to be called Revolt Has Begun and Governments Will Fall. So I want to start today with a quote, as I often do, from a man named Enoch Powell. And he said as follows: "As I look into the future, I have foreboding. I seem to see, like the Roman, the river Tiber flowing with blood." Now that quote comes from a very famous speech that those of you who are watching from the UK probably know very well. It's called the Rivers of Blood speech, and it was given by Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell was a member of Parliament in the 1960s, and he was the first major substantive opposition to mass immigration into the United Kingdom. And the reason for that opposition was because of the introduction of what he strongly opposed, which was called Commonwealth immigration. Basically, it was the idea that in the former colonies of the United Kingdom, people could move to the UK and have the full rights and citizenship of British subjects, and he foresaw that as a disaster for the future of England. And it seems his forecast for a kind of violence and racial conflict has proved to be correct.
This country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
So what's happened over the last few days is the murdering, the tragic killing of 3 young British girls. I don't know the details, and I don't know exactly who killed these young girls, but it has created a flashpoint over the last few days that's provoked the animus, the backlash of the British public. Now, the specific details do matter, and I suspect that they will be forthcoming in the weeks ahead. But what's more important, the larger context, is that we in the Western world, not just in the United Kingdom, not just in England, are getting closer to a political explosion, a massive backlash against over 50 years of policies, especially immigration policies, that have been directly existentially threatening to the populations, that have been injurious to average Britons, average Germans, average Frenchmen, average Canadians, average Americans, and now it's sort of popping off in a social conflagration. What's important, however, is that while this backlash brought a lot of Britons into the streets to protest and display their anger, their frustration, not just with the government, but with the large, massive immigrant population that has established itself in the United Kingdom, especially in London over the last several decades, is that the government itself was very quick to condemn the backlash.
Be in no doubt, those that have participated in this violence will face the full force of the law. The police will be making arrests, individuals will be held on remand, charges will follow, and convictions will follow. I guarantee you will regret taking part in this disorder, whether directly or those whipping up this action online and then running away themselves. This is not protest. It is organised, violent thuggery, and it has no place on our streets or online.
And this condemnation was issued very quickly and reactively, you might say, by the Prime Minister, the newly elected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, a man named Keir Starmer. Now, Keir Starmer is the leader of the Labour Party and a avowed leftist, and he has done what more or less every significant political figure in England and across the Western world has done over the last several decades, and that is to immediately condemn right-wing racism and extremism as the problem and somehow alleviate the situation by causing them to disperse and threatening them with government action, while at the same time moving very quickly to protect the immigrant populations.
I've just seen the Birmingham footage of Muslims beating a man at the front of a pub, about 15 of them, absolutely no police about. Yeah, we've got that footage, we'll play that for you as well. There seems to be an awful lot of misinformation, disinformation, and you can watch it now as we see the cars screaming around a roundabout in Birmingham, not far away from Jess Phillips' constituency, but there's no police to be seen anywhere. So, I mean, I'm sorry, if you're going to pretend that there is no two-tier policing, I'm afraid this would suggest absolutely the opposite is true.
Now, this is a strategy that we've seen applied routinely. We saw it in the United States during the George Floyd riots in 2020. We've seen it repeatedly done in France, where they've had massive skirmishing between Muslims of various kinds in Paris, for instance. We've also seen this practice by the German government rather shamelessly. What's different, however, this time is that sort of virtue signaling combined with censorship and threatening people with the power of the state appears to only be fueling and exploding the situation even worse. So what's really happening? Where are we headed with all of this? Keir Starmer, like his predecessors, is sort of sitting atop a tinderbox, and that tinderbox is beginning to detonate. It's a social tinderbox, it's a political tinderbox, it's a financial tinderbox, but the elites, the governments, who are all led by the same people, whether they're right, left, or otherwise, they're all more or less of the same mindset, and that mindset is that when in doubt, we will apply these talking points, we will threaten the local native-born population, and that will very quickly disperse these crowds, shut down these protests, and we can get right back to the utopia that we had before. Except that now that's not working. And so Keir Starmer very stupidly came out and condemned the right-wing hooligans that were behind the violence in Great Britain. Of course, the problem with that statement, as I'm sure you know, is that London has been besieged by violent stabbing crime. The same kind of violence and criminality is seen in Paris, it's seen in Berlin. It's very similar to the crime that we have from illegal immigration in the United States, for instance, which often involves human trafficking, pedophilia, drugs, and all the rest of it. But governments have done nothing about those problems. All they've done is virtue signal, and year to date, it has worked, but now it's not working. Now populations are sufficiently badgered by the virtue signaling, they're sufficiently broken down by the economy, they're sufficiently frightened, intimidated, and bullied by the demographic change that's happened that they're beginning to resist. And I emphasize resistance and revolt because a lot of people have said for the last decade, maybe more, that no resistance would ever come. There would be no pushback. Of course there's going to be pushback, ladies and gentlemen. Of course there's going to be a counter thrust. That's the nature of humanity. It's the nature of populations who tend to descend into tribalism when they feel threatened. And of course, that's what's happening. The national consciousness of the British population, the national consciousness of Americans, of Canadians, is coming to the fore, and it's only going to intensify. Keir Starmer has not, however, just condemned verbally these protests. He's also intimating that he will use the force of the British military. Now, you have to think about this for a moment here. Great Britain and London in particular have been inundated with mass migration and the subsequent uptick in crime and social instability over the last several decades, to which the British government has done nothing. They haven't addressed it. They don't even talk about it publicly. Much as in America, we don't talk about an explosion in black criminality, for instance, which has overwhelmed cities like Chicago and Philadelphia. Very similar kind of blackout occurs. There's no real substantive discussion of those problems, and so they fester and they get worse. Well, now that there's even tepid resistance that's beginning to expand beyond just a few groups that are raising attention to this, now Keir Starmer wants to use the military. What he's doing, unwittingly or otherwise, is provoking a massive revolt that's going to bring down his government. Governments are going to fall. They're fragile. And this is a point I've emphasized again and again, in part because a lot of people, including my audience, doesn't believe me when I say this. You assume that these governments are strong, they're robust, or rather that the globalists, puppet masters behind them, have secretly orchestrated all of this to their ends. Look, obviously there are untoward actors that figure into what's happening. There's no question about it. But the globalists are not in control. What's happening is that they have actually sowed the seeds for a massive backlash that's going to reverse a lot of what's happened since the 1960s. Enoch Powell, in other words, was right. The British population is going to revolt against Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer's government is not going to survive this, and you're going to see a very similar kind of cyclical turnover of governments that you saw in Great Britain a couple years ago when Boris Johnson resigned.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister.
And then Liz Truss resigned.
I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
And then Rishi Sunak came to power. Subsequently, his government was more or less thrown out.
I will shortly be seeing His Majesty the King to offer my resignation as Prime Minister. To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry.
All of the Western world are dominated by parties that have no answers for any of these problems. The bureaucracies, the executives that are running the Western world are the worst people that we've ever had. But importantly, they're not terribly competent, and they don't recognize that the same kind of reactionary policies, the virtue signaling, the censorship, the strident condemnation of racism and nationalism, that's not going to work anymore. It's only going to provoke an asymmetrical response, which is going to bring them down. So in the months ahead, you're going to see these governments rattle and collapse. New elections will probably bring new governments to power. And if they don't enact the will of the populations that they're dealing with, then they will fall too. This is just the beginning, in other words, of a massive shift that's been long overdue. And of course, it's going to be led by masculinity. It's going to be led by the neo-masculine movement. It's going to be led by Masco-Nationalism. All of these ideas, which can't be bought, which can't be satiated or satisfied or mollified by the usual tricks that these governments have employed over the last several decades and longer. So revolt has just begun and governments will fall. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.